I'm Ilan. I just joined this year. I'm very excited to be with you. I've really enjoyed it. I thought about joining for a long time. I haven't gotten to know many of you yet, but through Talmud class and Tzemach's wisdom literature class, I've gotten to know some of you, and I've really enjoyed it. So I'm going to talk to you about philosophy, and I'm a little nervous because I never gave this type of talk. I've spoken about philosophy, but this is different. It's not a linear argument, so to speak. I'm going to, it's not a linear argument, and there's so much I could say about this, and this is very intimate. And what I realized preparing is that you don't get to speak about things that are so intimate that much, but I think it's nice, it's appropriate, because I get to share with you. And I remember I was talking to Devira after Talmud class the other day, and she said one of the things that she enjoys about the community is the getting to know everybody and the intimacy, and it's really a community. So I'm going to start by talking about how I got into philosophy, why it became so important to me, and really I'm going to start talking about my early life, and it's actually very, very appropriate that I talk about my life, and I'm not used to talking about that. I'm not always so comfortable talking about my life, but it's actually very appropriate because philosophy is personal at the end of the day, and it's very important. And it upsets me that there's a general sense in the world that that it's not, that it's kind of somehow abstract, not connected to life. That it's recondite, what have you, highfalutin. It's not. You know, we just had an election, for example, and everybody voted. And they voted based on what? On their values. Your values are based on other beliefs. You believe certain things about the way things are. So you have a metaphysics, you have an epistemology, because you believe that you know certain ways. Right, so I hope to make that more clear during the talk. The philosophy is really personal, and it's important, and it's transformative, to use maybe a new agey kind of word, but I want to make it a little bit more rigorous than that. So I was born in Israel. I came to America when I was 3, and I come from a Bukharian family. My grandfather is actually the president and the founder of the community, and of the Bukharian community in Queens. And family, I don't know if you know Bukharian. I mean, Sephardic culture in general is very different. Bukharian is a subsection of Sephardic. Family is very important. We were very close, very large family. We would have 20, 30 people at every Shabbat, holidays. Remember Passovers. My cousins would come, and so on and so forth. And, you know, we'd sleep 3 in a bed, but I always looked forward to it. It was very nice. I think I had a really, a very nice version of a Jewish upbringing. And it was centered, my Jewish upbringing was centered around the family. It was the Judaism structured the family. My grandfather, for example, his synagogue was Orthodox, but he would ask me, for example, to if he was running late, he'd drive me to the synagogue, just drop me off at the corner so nobody sees, you know, things like that. So it wasn't, you know, very rigid. It was really family-centered, and the Judaism was for the family. Then I became a teenager, and you start questioning things. And I went to a more religious school. So I went to Solomon Schechter in Queens as an elementary school, and then I went to Flatbush for my first 2 years of high school. Only 2 years. You could tell that it didn't end up so great. But so I went to Flatbush, and all of a sudden I get a sense of a different, you know, things are different. There's different thoughts, different values, different ways of life, even within Judaism, right? And I started questioning things, you know, as you do at that age. I was a particularly sensitive kid, so maybe I did a little bit more than other people. And I saw this contrast. You know, I was very earnest. So, for example, I remember my sister had her bar mitzvah, and we had a party, but on the day of her English birthday, we went to a Chinese place. And I remember being like, well, we're Jewish, we can't eat Chinese. I mean, on this day of all days, you know? So I had this kind of like earnestness. I had this desire to like live, you know, well, do what you say you do, right? Be authentic. But in Flatbush, I remember I started questioning more. So, for example, I'll just give you examples of things that struck me. So, for example, there are little things, big things. Prayer. I see people, it's very important to be there 7:00. You pray, you get punished if you don't. But, on the other hand, I don't know if you've been to an Orthodox congregation, but it doesn't seem very meaningful. It's kind of rote. And I'm like, all right, is this really what God had in mind? So you start questioning. Other things are like, we learned about Maimonides. So Maimonides talks about God. We even say it in a prayer in the 13 attributes. You say that God is non-corporeal. He's completely non-corporeal. But then I remember them talking about how meaningful it was to be them at the Wailing Wall, and I thought that I don't understand. If he's non-corporeal, he's not really anywhere. What makes that place more special? He's everywhere. Things like that. Kissing the Bible even seemed weird to me. Like it seemed a little bit like overly reverent, even verging on idol worship. And then we're saying that we don't do that. So it seemed, you notice the contradictions. Obviously, what was very stark was my home life was more centered around family. We had this thing where we would, we don't eat, some Jewish families have this where they eat kosher at home, but not outside. So then, you start questioning that. I remember a rabbi, I told him I went out to eat on a Saturday, and he made me feel bad about going out to eat on a Saturday. Oh my God. But the big questions came from these kind of events. And at the time, they weren't really articulated as philosophy. They were just kind of feelings. One I remember about kosherness, I remember some people ate unkosher food by mistake. All right. So they had to do some sort of who knows what to be forgiven. I don't remember. I was, I'm 13 or 14 at the time. I just remember they had to do some extra credit, I guess. So I'm thinking to myself, well, I mean, God knows they did it by mistake, right? What's the big deal, So is it that we just have to obey God? So I started asking, so what makes being kosher right? And it doesn't seem right? So is it just that we're obeying him? I mean, then he knows we just did it by accident. On the other hand, maybe the world is such that he's telling us that eating kosher is bad, eating non-kosher is bad for us. In that case, then maybe you have to do something. So it's kind of this proto-Yusufer dilemma, which I'll explain in a second. But it's kind of this, why are things good? Why does God tell us to do things? Is it just because he says them that they're good? Or is it more that that the world is such as it is and he's telling us? But then if that's the case, then it's not God that's so important, right? It's really, there's an ethical code aside from God. He's just telling us. So that was one big, right? It wasn't philosophy yet to me. It was just kind of this feeling of insatisfaction. The other thing that was happening was I was very unhappy. I was unhappy again. You're becoming a teenager. You're also going to high school that, isn't satisfying you intellectually, socially. And I started thinking about, meaning of life sort of questions. I started asking, so I don't like school and I have to deal with this. Why I have to do well? Why? To go to a good college. And then you go to a good college so you can get a good job. And then what? When I'm 65 and I retire, then maybe I get to enjoy things. So this deep sense of, I was depressed. I was kind of that depressed, teenager, tortured soul type. But these questions were real. And I think, I was just more sensitive and I was facing up to them. And this is actually an early formation. Again, it wasn't so articulated at the time. It was more just feeling. But this is something that's something like in philosophy you call the problem of evil. So let me explain to you the Yusufer dilemma and the problem of evil real quick, because I'll explain where I went later on. Euthyphro dilemma is, like I said about kosherness, it's why are things good? Why does God say things are good? Are they good just because he says so? Well, kind of like, pick a number that I'm thinking of, right? Maybe I'm thinking of 4. So is it right just because I happen to be thinking of it? Or am I saying something, or am I saying something is good because it is good? That's the way the world is. Kind of more like 2 plus 2 is 4. I would say 2 plus 2 is 4 because 2 plus 2 is 4. And once you understand that dilemma, you kind of understand that religion really doesn't provide a moral framework. And to a teenager, what that meant to me, it didn't tell me how I should live my life. What's good about life, right? Why is it that I'm going to school? I have to do well, then I have to get a good job, and the whole 9 yards. On the other hand, if it's good independent of him, then he has nothing to do with ethics, right? Then you don't have to have a religious life for that. So already I was starting to move away from religion, and I was starting to look for other things. I wasn't ready yet to call myself an atheist, but I was ready to look for other things. The problem of evil also. The problem of evil, again, in philosophy, goes like this. It says, well, if there's a God, he's all-knowing, he's all good, and he's benevolent. He's all-knowing, all good, and all-powerful. And if he's all-knowing, he knows the suffering. If he's all good, he'll want to end it. And if he's all-powerful, he can. So why is there suffering? So as a kid, I'm asking myself, what is, why can't I, I don't understand. If this is, and for me as a kid, the two were kind of going hand in hand. There was kind of a commingling of the Euthyphro dilemma and the problem of evil. Because I'm asking, I understand if we're just obeying God, if he's just making us go through hoops, I don't understand, why can't he just do heaven now, right? And if not, it's not because God, if we have to go through it, then what is it? I mean, it has nothing to do with God. I was searching for what that was. So I was very depressed, and I didn't really have meaning, and I was starting to move away from God. And on the other hand, I thought to myself, well, all right, so what's the alternative? So for me, Machiavellianism seemed like the alternative. Now, Machiavelli, right? So if you're not going to live a good life in the conventional sense, then what do you live? Well, then you try and increase your own advantage, happiness, whatever it is. But that didn't seem like a great alternative, because it just seems like you're in a constant state of warfare, right? You're always trying to figure out how to get ahead. You do love people, so what is it? Is that an authentic relationship then, or do you use them to your advantage? Are they a means, or are they an end, right? Are they someone you love and respect, or are they someone that you use as a means? So that didn't seem very satisfying either. And I remember at the same time, I started reading the Bible for myself, and it's amazing what happens when you start reading things for yourself and not relying on other people. I remember reading Genesis, and just at the beginning, I remember reading the story of Adam and Eve and the snake. And Adam, it says, first of all, that God created Adam and Eve in his image and likeness. Now, most people say, okay, that means we're like somehow. I actually see it differently. I remember thinking to myself, why would be image and likeness? What's different, an image from the real thing? And an image lacks content. It's just formal. It's just form. So what happens next in the story? So what happens next is the snake says, God says you're going to die, but you're not going to die. He knows that this is good and you're going to be like him. And it turns out that he was right. He was right. not only did they know good and evil, they became. So what does that mean, to know good and evil? And remember, in Judaism, the word to know has carnal implications, right? So to know has material implications. So to me, what that meant is, I should go back. Also, the snake wasn't wrong. They didn't die that day. And they didn't die that day. And they, the other thing that occurred to me is, why would, how could God tell them, punish them for disobeying something when they didn't know good from evil, right? They don't know good from evil yet. How do they know not to eat from the thing? So the story didn't make sense that they had a fall and they did something wrong. No, something else is going on there. And to me, at the time, it made a lot of sense, because I'm in a place, I'm struggling with meaning of life issues. And what this was telling me is that the snake was actually the hero. You have to go out and find contentness yourself. So that was very meaningful. And you have to take responsibility for your own life. So, and those are the first sins, right? Adam says, what God comes to him and he says, why'd you eat that? Oh, Eve, she made me do it. And he asks Eve, why'd you do it? And she says, oh, the snake, the snake made me do it. There's this constant fear of responsibility, so to speak. Happens with Cain and Abel. Am I my brother's keeper? Right? And at the time, it struck me that therefore, if you don't know what the meaning of life is, well, that's the purpose then. Let's find out. To go after the meaning of life. And at that point, it was still an instrumental good. It's right, okay, so I don't know what the meaning of life is, so that's a meaning, that's the purpose. But it's actually, and it still was through my youth, but it's more than that. It's not fair to say it's just that, because all of a sudden you have a purpose, right? You get up in the morning, you feel enlivened, you want to go out. There's a purpose for you to get up in the morning. But it still was, to an extent, instrumental at that point. And what I want by the end of this to convey is that it's more than just an instrumental good. It's an intrinsic good. And we'll get there shortly. First, I want to back up. I want to do a little history of philosophy. And I want to do a little history of philosophy. First of all, you might be saying at this point, yeah, all right, philosophy, it's great, it's interesting, but I know some philosophers. I've read some of them. I've read about them. They're not so great, not all of them, right? And that's true. Philosophy has kind of let us down. So I want to go back to the history of two different traditions, and I think it'll be instructive. It'll be it's interesting on its own, and I think it will be. It's relevant to the topic, and you'll see how. So, and I'm mainly going to talk about 20th century philosophy, but I have to go back to the roots a little earlier. So, there's two main traditions, and they divided really in the 20th century. They really they don't even talk to each other. They don't regard each other. They look down on each other. One is the Continental Tradition. That's the continent of Europe, France, Germany, blah, blah, blah. The other is the Anglo-American, otherwise known as Analytic Tradition. Now, going back a little earlier, the continental philosophers tended to be rationalists. So if you do early modern philosophy, if you take an intro course, you'll get Leibniz, Descartes, Spinoza. These are rationalists. A rationalist is someone who thinks that you know the world through ideas. You could sit in your, right, like Descartes. What does Descartes do? He just sits in a room, turns out the lights, and says, I doubt everything. And then he goes from there, builds up his system of philosophy. Empiricists say, no, you know the world through looking, through your senses, through empirical data. Now, those are very different. That leads to very different outlooks on life. But they still really spoke to each other then. And still, in both traditions, although mostly in Continental, you get the type of thinkers that have real worldviews, real full-fledged philosophies, real worldviews, something where you can, you could just study that philosopher. So let me talk, I'll start with the Continental tradition, how that took off, and then I'll go back to the Analytic. Okay? So the Continental tradition, actually, the last philosopher that the two traditions both study is Kant. And Kant's a great philosopher, very full-blooded. He has a very thick metaphysics, epistemology. People study him if they want to justify religious belief. They study him if they want to justify secular ethics, two totally divergent things. They study him if they want to understand more about innate ideas, like a Chomsky, innate ideas, or Platonist, things like that. He's very fecund philosopher, but he, again, I can't go too much into the philosophy. I want to give you a bird's eye view so you understand the development and how we got to today. What he did is he split up the world into the nominal world and the phenomenal world. The phenomenal world is the one that we see. It's the empirical world. And that's not just there. We have categories in our faculties, in our brain, that impose those structures on the world. Then there's the noumena, which is transcendent. Now, this is how he could do things like say that we have free will on the one hand, but also say we're determinist. I'll get back to that maybe a little bit later. But it was a very big synthetic philosopher. Now, after him on the Continental side is Hegel. And Hegel kind of dispenses with the phenomenal world to an extent. It's just a new, well, no, not exactly. What he dispenses with is exteriority, really. He's an idealist. So he's saying all there really is the phenomenal world where you impose your ideas on the world. And what he does from there is he traces the history of our ideas. So really philosophy from then becomes very historical oriented. He goes back and shows how philosophy advances, and his idea is that eventually advances towards an absolute idea. So he still, even though he untethered the exterior world from ideas, he's still on a certain path. There's still a linearity towards, right? There's a beginning and an end. We go from more rudimentary concepts to absolute idea, which is, whatever, like an idea of heaven, let's put it, although that's simplistic. Now, he left one thing, and so this is a very comprehensive philosophy. It subsumes everything, right? There isn't, one of the Heidegger later said that only Hegel can see beyond the shadow of Hegel, because he subsumes every other philosopher, right? He can kind of account for everybody after him because he's just saying, oh, that's a stage in the dialectic, in the advance of philosophical ideas. What he forgets is us as the individual. He doesn't say anything. It's just kind of this massive force of history working upon us. And so every philosopher afterwards, at least immediately, kind of responds to that. So you have Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Sartre, Camus. They all become they're what about us? But they have, again, the sense of experience of, they focus on human experience, right? So it's not history of the world, it's a personal human experience. They kind of reacting to Hegel that way. And what happens is that they start to, their philosophy becomes much more first person, much more like literature. And if you think about the great philosophers in the Continental tradition, some of them are really literary giants. Kierkegaard is a literary genius. Nietzsche is a literary genius. Sartre, Camus, some of them, I'd argue, are better in the literary, or have a greater impact in the literary world than the philosophical world. But what they're trying to do is talk about the human in the world. they're trying to make meaning. And the analytic philosophers we'll later see kind of don't really, they kind of look down on this. But they're trying to make meaning. In the 20th century, Heidegger, 20th century, something happens in both the analytic and the Continental Tradition. There's something called the linguistic turn. Things start centering on language. Language becomes the departure for understanding the rest of their philosophical systems. So just to give you, again, Heidegger is a big topic, and I read him a long time ago, but just to give you a sense of the type of things that he's concerned with, he talks about being there, being in the world. He talks about anxiety, facing death, things like that. And it's, again, a very robust metaphysics, but his approach to language is he's trying to get behind language. He thinks language, I don't want to say conceal because that comes later, but it's a more poetic, even a mystical approach. Now, why is this important? Because now we start becoming, the philosophy starts becoming even more detached from what we think of as rational argument, point A to point B. Because the next step is later on postmodernism. And the pioneer, the real big name in postmodernism is Derrida, deconstruction. Now, what happens with Derrida, he's less existentialist, so to speak, but he kind of takes off from Hegel, right? This narrative of history moving towards completion, so to speak. What happens is he removes the linearity. So it becomes circular. So it's kind of like, I remember a professor describing, it's kind of like the Talmud in a way, where there's commentary, and on top of the commentary, there's commentary, and on top of that commentary, there's more commentary. And you know how I don't know how many of you are familiar, but the Talmud is like there's something, there's commentary in the center, and then around, and then around, and then there's other books. But there's nothing actually in the center. There's no actually reference point. You could think about it, you know, there's a quote that we get from Aristotle about pre-Socratic philosophers, and Derrida brings it up. Heraclitus says, you can't step in the same river twice. So Cratylus, right, so that's the world is in flux, blah, blah. Cratylus comes along and says, you can't step in the same river once. Now, what does that mean? That nothing is self-same. So in Derrida's philosophy, what that means is that it's just narrative, right? You can't really get beyond narrative. And if there's something beyond it, I don't know, he won't commit. He actually says something when asked if he's an atheist, he goes, to give you an example of postmodernism, and when we get to this, why people get very frustrated, which is the next topic. He says, so they ask him if he's an atheist, he goes, I justly pass as an atheist. What are you talking about? Right? What does that mean? Now, he can't say it any other way if you understand his philosophy, because his philosophy is purely parasitic. He never writes just an essay. He does. But mostly he writes about other figures, and he's undermining their philosophy. Because he can't commit to a point. If it's all narrative and there's nothing underneath, then he's just a narrative also. He can't really commit. But that leads us to the excesses and why continental philosophy kind of failed us. And I have to say that I actually really think, you know, a lot of people in the analytic tradition, especially, Derrida, that's crazy stuff to them. And I'll explain to you why they think so. But I think it's actually really brilliant. I think you may be, again, I'm just waving my hand at this, but it's kind of, you know, maybe you could justify as like a Tao Te Ching type of thing, right? In the Tao Te Ching, there's a line that says, those who say don't know and those who know don't say, right? The slipperiness of meaning, stuff like that. I actually think that, but he doesn't sustain himself as a philosophy on its own. It's just kind of like, it needs a shell. And we see from that quote, I justly pass it as an atheist. Why? Now, why does that show the excesses? Well, one is we don't know what he's talking about. It's very hard to understand what he's talking about. And he is the best philosopher, let's put it, of the postmodernists, or the paradigm. His imitators are worse. I mean, they copy his style, but I don't think there's even the substance, and people question the substance of even Derrida's philosophy. So it becomes a lot about style, a lot of mumbo, like jargon, and we don't know what they're talking about. So it's weak. It's not clear. That's the first sin of. Now, what does that lead to? It leads to not clear thinking. So this guy Alan Sokal was a physicist at NYU. In 1996, he turned in a paper to the prominent postmodern periodical. I think it's called Social Text. And it had all, he got the jargon. I read it lately. He actually he's actually more clear than most of the postmodern philosophers, but he got the jargon down, and he puts in stuff about incompleteness theorem, uncertainty principle. If you don't know what that is, uncertainty is a scientific result that in quantum mechanics again, I don't understand it completely myself, but it basically, that our knowledge or the world itself is indeterminate, and incompleteness is a result about math by Gödel. That math is either not complete or not sound, and the postmodernists love this. Now, why do they love this? Because what he did was, and I didn't explain this yet, he used this to say to attack the power structure, so to speak. So going back to Derrida's philosophy, when he talks about language, he says it's binary, it's dichotomies, right? So there's black, white, there's good, bad, there's male, female. But these are all just narratives. And so the priority has been male. Why? The priority has been white, not black, as far as race, right? Why? Well, that's ideology was inserted into that. Right. So what happened with the postmodernists is that despite the fact that they really shouldn't be allowed to affirm truths, right, because everything's narrative, they do, and they I wish I could make this a little bit more intuitive, but they in any case, they use it to silence for social justice, which is a good intention, but it's a kind of a chilling effect, because they say anytime someone says something they don't like, they say, okay, well, now you're using this traditional narratives, which has this ideology we don't like. So Alan Sokal does this paper, which does exactly this, using these great scientific and mathematical results, and he's a prominent scientist, and they love to have it, and they accept it. And after they accept it, and they put it on the front page and everything, I think, if I remember correctly, he says it's a hoax, which shows that they were not, so their standards had fallen, just because, right, there was a fashion, there was this movement, and whatever suited it, whatever sounded good, fine, let's use it. But the intellectual standards weren't there anymore. So from being unclear in language, they become unclear thinking. And what happened? And the third sin, so those are the first two sins. And the third sin is became very chilling. That's when you got political correctness on campuses and stuff like that. Now, if we go back a little bit, we find out why people fear it a little more. A lot of the intellectuals earlier embraced really terrible intellectual pursuits, or social programs, I should say. Heidegger was a Nazi, and he was terrible. His mentor was Husserl, who was a Jew. When Husserl lost his job, he didn't do anything for him, kind of lost contact. Sartre, and I think Sartre was a pro-Stalin guy. A lot of intellectuals back then were. So we see the danger if, right, that was a different environment. Those were more real, were closer, they were more accessible, those ideologies. So that's where That's where continental philosophy has failed us. Analytic philosophy, okay, let's do analytic philosophy. Let me see if I'm forgetting something. Anyway, whatever. Analytic philosophy is another, has a very different worldview. As a matter of fact, it doesn't really. But let's go into that. So remember that the continental philosophers came from a tradition of rationalism. The Anglo-American or analytic tradition comes from a tradition of empiricism, where you see things, and that prioritizes science, math and science. Now, you might think math, why math? That's more rational, right? That's, you just sit in a room and you do math. But the thing about math is it's really not useful on its own, generally, unless you apply it to the world and to science in particular, right? Where math has really become useful or impactful is for quantum mechanics, relativity, blah, sciences. The other thing about them that they have in common is that they're more problem-oriented, right? So in continental philosophy, we had these philosophers about the meaning of life, being in the world, blah, blah, blah. In analytic philosophy, we have people doing a problem. And contemporary, if you do contemporary philosophy, analytic philosophy, which most of America does, you'll do philosophy of mind or philosophy of math or philosophy of religion or something like that. It's a problem and it's a communal approach. So how did it get that way, or what was their concern and how did they fail us? Well, okay. Back around the Enlightenment, some philosophers, and this was continental philosophers too, Leibniz was a big guy in this, they wanted to come up with a conceptual language. They wanted to clarify language. And wouldn't that be great if we could clarify language? Because then all our thoughts would be clear. We wouldn't have any misunderstandings. We'd know what's true, what's not true. And we can calculate, right? Just like math, since you have symbols, and you can manipulate them, right? Instead of counting in your head in a room and doing calculations, it increases your power to calculate. And what can you do with that? So logic, however, hadn't really made progress since Aristotle. Now, Aristotle, the classic syllogism is Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. What they did in the 1800s, Boole and then Frege, they said they took out the non-logical words and they put variables. So man can be A, right? And they for the logical words, right, all, therefore, they put in certain symbols. And that way they were able to calculate. And they thought this is great. And logic really made, all of a sudden, after 1800 years, all of a sudden, more, it was like 2000. All of a sudden, they're making all these great advances in logic. Actually, I'll come to that later. So philosophers in the 20th century in the Analytic tradition were like, this is great. Now, they still had, remember, the other thing that was happening, so they have logic, which is making, the other thing that's happening is science is all of a sudden, right? Early in like the late 1800s, there was some guy, some prominent scientist or something that said, I think soon physics will be finished. We'll understand everything there is to know about physics. So that is maybe one of the worst predictions ever. What happened was relativity happened, special relativity happened, quantum mechanics happened. Then, right, so 1905 was Einstein's first paper, 1917 was his second paper, then quantum mechanics in the 1920s, so on. And all of a sudden, so science was really, even before that, the empiricists were like, right, we have to study things empirically. Now, all of a sudden, there was the payoff. We can understand things empirically. So what did philosophers think? They're like, okay, well, this is our place. So there was this scientistic worldview. Scientism means the prominence of science, right? So science is king, pretty much. Well, maybe we'll go into that a little more. And then we have these logical advances. So now what we could do, so what does philosophy do? So philosophy clarifies sentences, it clarifies thoughts. And then science, right, once we have clear sentences, we could test them and, we can get empirical results. So while Heidegger was doing, the linguistic turn for him was he was kind of trying to get behind it. It was poetic. There was a mystery, right? He was trying to get behind language. They were like focused on language. As a matter of fact, one of the great papers, Ernie, you'll know, right? I don't know if we talked about this, but one of the great papers of the time was called On Denoting by Russell. I forget the year exactly, but do you want to know what On Denoting is about? It's a logical analysis of the present king of France is bald. Does that sound exciting? It's not exciting. Now we're getting to the excesses of analytic philosophy, or the opposite. It's really the opposite of the excesses, what you want to call it, the sin. Now, it's actually an important paper, and if you understand the motivation of analytic philosophy, maybe you get to import more, but slowly but surely, analytic philosophy started receding right when, a continental philosophy was life, existentialism, what does it mean to be a man in the world, accepting responsibility. They were receding from that. They're talking about the present king of France is bald. And how do you analyze that sentence? And how do you get truth values? What they did have was rigor. They certainly did not have that, but they didn't get very far. Now, the verificationists were these guys who got together and say, we're going to clarify sentences and then science can do its empirical thing. Verification didn't work for two reasons. One is because math, incompleteness theorem, things like that. It showed that math couldn't be, you can't clarify within a logical system. Anyway, that's complicated. I don't even remember all that. I studied that a long time ago. But the other thing is verificationism itself isn't verifiable, right? So the verificationist said, right, you have analytic sentences, like a triangle is 180 degrees, right? You don't learn it, you personally might, but there's nothing new about a triangle is 180 degrees, right? 180 degrees is part of the definition of a triangle. And then you have other sentences like John is tall. There's nothing about John that tells you he's tall, so you're learning something new about the world. Those are synthetic? Yeah, anyway, synthetics. Analytic and synthetic, yeah. So sentences are either analytic or synthetic, and they're verifiable one of those two ways, or they're meaningless. What about that very sentence, right? What about verificationism? Is that verifiable? No. So they got so involved in this project that they lost sight of, right, the fact that their own project didn't live up to its own standards. And that continues to today. And you'll find in philosophy departments, it's actually gotten better lately, but I've had philosophers, I remember speaking to one and they were talking, his work was so abstruse. And he was saying about the criticism that, they might as well be paying him to do, to play chess or to do word games or stuff like that. He's like, well, what's wrong with that? That's not a very ambitious view of philosophy, right? Others, talk about philosophy being the handmaiden of science, which to me is offensive. I think philosophy is the king and the queen. They would say things like, in any case, philosophy became very removed from people's lives. Quine, who's one of the great thinkers in the analytic tradition, was asked about, well, it's getting very technical for the public to follow. And he was like, okay, well, math is technical, science is, so what, So it became very removed. And so the excess of that way of thinking is that it undermines the point of philosophy. What was the point of philosophy, right? It's about values. It's about how, and how we come to those values. So the analytic tradition failed us. So it failed us so much that it actually even came to a point, now today, the sexy, if you could call philosophy sexy, the sexy topic is consciousness. And there's a whole school of philosophers, and these are very bright people. They will tell you that consciousness does not exist. They're called limitativists. So on the one hand, you have continental philosophers that are all about the human experience. On the other hand, you have analytic philosophers who deny the very basic fact of human experience, right? There's a philosopher, Galen Strauss, and I happen to have his book right here. He has an essay on it, and he calls it, what does he call it? The silliest claim. And he has a whole essay about this. So you're right. If you say, I've read these philosophers, they're not so great. How do they solve our problem? I'm trying hard. Well, I have some good quotes by him, but I'll skip that. They're people. They're people, and they're smart people. And sometimes when you're smart, you could dig yourself a deeper hole because you're better at digging holes, right? And they're given to the same fallibilities as all of us. The lesson shouldn't be that, therefore, philosophy, what you're right, that doesn't, solve anything. The lesson should be, look how fallible we all are. If such smart people who got into this because they felt some sort of urge, that should be the lesson. Now, I can give you the arguments against them. It's not really the point. I could defend philosophy because it has had a big practical impact. All that stuff about logic, that led to computer science. So this Zoom call that we're doing right now, that's philosophy. Thank you, philosophy, right? That started with Aristotle 2,000 years ago. So I defend it in that sense. Democracy, you like democracy? Well, liberal values? Well, Montesquieu, Rousseau, Locke, those are more on the democratic. Liberal values, J.S. Mill, right? You like those? Are good. Now, what an analytic philosopher, one of these guys might say is, we know. So now we moved on. There had to be a last philosopher. All right. They're missing the point. I could get more into that. They're missing the point. The point is, and I want to make, that philosophy is personal. It's not exactly just about what philosophy you end up with. It's how you do it. You have to do philosophy. So before I go on, let me just see if there's something else important that I want. And I could give you examples, but it's getting late. I say I'm very verbose as usual. Sorry if I procrastinate a lot doing this because I wanted to, this is a very large topic. I wanted to fit a lot in, and I took out half of what I wanted to talk about. But let me move on. So I talked about how I came to philosophy. I talked about the history, a little bit of history. So now I'm going to tell you the meaning of life. Ready? I'm going to tell you the meaning of life. I'm being facetious a little bit, but I am telling you something. Remember I said that I thought philosophy was, it was an instrumental good, right? So not exactly just instrumental good, but it was instrumental, right? If you don't know the answer, look for the answer. And that gives you a purpose and a meaning, and that's important. But really, it's more than that. So how do you do philosophy? How is it personal? Wait, I feel like I'm forgetting something important. Okay, how do we do it? So there's 3 steps. The first step is doubt. Now, the first step is doubt. Doubt is very important. It's very hard to doubt ourselves. But the thing is, if you're really looking for the truth, you have to start with, well, I don't know. I have to search for the truth. So if you're in that mindset of really looking for the truth, you have to remove the veil of certainty, and you have to break the wall of ego. And we have many reasons to do that. Once you start looking into this stuff, there's many reasons. There's logical fallacies we could go into. There's under biology, right? The brain. There's literature about the brain being something like kludge, meaning it was developed at different times to respond to different problems, not to our problems today. So we're not. There's a lot of the ones I want to focus on are actually more psychological, right? Things like groupthink, right? We have the story Emperor's New Clothes, which we all know about, which meaningful. There's even something called the Abilene Paradox, which is different than groupthink. Groupthink, you actually think differently because of group pressure. In Abilene Paradox, you do something, you don't, right? The Abilene Paradox is like, let's say 3 people are deciding to do something. Nobody actually wants to do it, but they do it because each person thinks the other person wants to do it. So this is how history could go off the rails also, right? The two that I want to bring up are, I spoke, this talk came out of a talk with Ernie and Ray. We talked about the Milgram experiment and the Stanford prison experiment. Are you guys familiar with these? Yeah, that's an important one. So just real quick, the Stanford experiment was Stanford students, which are not exactly run-of-the-mill people, right? This is supposed to be the creme de la creme. They were divided up. Some were to take the role of prisoners, some as wardens. The wardens became very abusive. The prisoners had nervous breakdowns. That's a very short summary. It's if you don't know about it, it's actually really something to look into. It's an important study. It's very telling. Then there's the Milgram, where they had someone pretend to be a doctor and someone pretend to get shocked for not answering the doctor's questions correctly. And if you were in the experiment, you would be the person administering the shock. And it was amazing how many people inflicted severe pain on the subject because of they were being obedient to the doctor's orders. So we have a sense already of how manipulatable we are. So doubt, we have good reason to be doubtful. And if we do start doubting ourselves, already the world's a better place, because, we all like to think that, well, we're educated and we're good people, right? And that's because we see the people around us, the people that raised us, loved us, right? The people who are friends, they do nice things for us. So it's hard when you have that emotional attachment to think about them doing terrible things or having terrible thoughts. I remember thinking about writing an article called "The Humanization of the Nazis." Now, why? Now, not the humanization of Nazism, the humanization of the Nazis, because those are people. And so already it becomes clear why we should consider them human. Normally, we think of Nazis, right? It's so different from us. They're so radically different. But they weren't so radically different. It wasn't like they were walking around the streets and eating children's head off, right? They had families. They loved their kids. They were loyal friends. They had charities, I'm sure. They're humans, and we're humans. So we can fall into those same whatever excesses, again, to use that word, of the mind that they could fall into, we can. And we don't realize that a lot because again, I think it's because when we grow up, again, they had people they loved, their friends. Yeah, they're so nice to me. That's a decent person. You don't. So that emotional attachment trumps, so to speak, that the intellectual, right? So doubt is step one. If you're going to search for the truth, doubt. Now, you say this guy Ilan, he's a really optimistic, cheerful guy, right? He's like, we're like Nazis, we're like, right? He's a cheerful guy. Actually, I actually think this is very affirmative. I think instead of, waking up and doing affirmations, that skit on Saturday Night Live, where you go, you look in the mirror and you go, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and gosh darn it, people like me, right? I think the opposite. We should do the opposite. We should look and we should say, I'm so fallible. Look what, people do. I can do that. I have implicit biases. I give in to crowds, blah, blah, blah. But why is that affirmative? Why isn't that why shouldn't we feel like crap about ourselves? Because when you do that, you actually find that, but the part of that should be, but so is everybody else. But so is everybody else. Nobody else does it better than me. Once you do that, you strip off that allegiance to authority or tradition. You assert yourself, and you find that you have to assert yourself because you're in a world where people are fallible. So you have to rectify that. So there's a responsibility there for yourself, and if you care about it, for other people. So that's step one. Step two is the principle of charity. Now, by the way, all three of you, there's three steps. They're all the principle of charity. I'm just breaking them down into three. I think of them as the principle of charity. Now, the principle of charity doesn't have to do with putting money in a box. It's actually a philosophical notion, and it is actually, I think, maybe the earliest mention of it is in the Talmud. And they don't say principle of charity, but they say, I mean, they talk about tzedakah, but that's a different principle of charity. They talk about interpreting people in the best way possible, in the strongest way possible. So I think in Arichin, in the Talmud, Rab Meir talks about somebody who says something that people can't make sense of, and he's like, guys, he obviously didn't mean it literally, so let's use our noggin and interpret it in a rational way. And that's what philosophers of language in the Analytic tradition in the 20th century used it for. But it's become more. It's become, how do you treat somebody else's argument? Right, so Daniel Dennett, who's one of these guys who doesn't believe in consciousness, by the way, but anyway, he's a very smart guy nonetheless. He wrote rules for the principle of charity. He said, rule number one is you don't, the rule number one is when you have an interlocutor, whether it's you're writing against somebody or you have them in front of your face, or it's just an idea you're thinking about, before you even dare offer a rebuttal, what you say is, let me restate this person's claim, this argument, as clearly, vividly, strongly as I possibly can. Step two, what do we agree on? Especially if it's not general agreement, right? What do we agree about? Third step, what did I learn from him or her? What do I learn from my target? Only then do you rebut or criticize. Only then. Now we could see again, if people had this attitude, the world would be a better place. But I want to step back a second. He's talking about it as like, right, rules for a conversation. I want to go back into the mindset of somebody who's seeking truth, right? So you start with doubt. Now you say, well, what's true? You're like Descartes sitting in the room and you doubt everything and saying, what's true? And now you have ideas. Now, when you're evaluating an idea, you have to make it as strong as possible if you really value truth, right? It's kind of, think about it, if you're playing a basketball game or you're preparing for a football game or basketball game, do you prepare for the weakest version or the strongest version of your opponent? You want to prepare for the strongest realistic version because, right, otherwise you won't be prepared to play the game. If you're fighting a war, you prepare for the strongest possible version, realistic version. Similarly, you want to test your ideas. So you want to test it against the strongest idea. But what happens when you do this is you have to, it turns into, from becoming charitable in the sense that we're using it philosophically, into something else. It becomes, you start to understand someone's world. I remember when I was talking with Ray and Ernie said, I think maybe a friend of his, or he had an analogy. It's like living in someone's house, right? You see their worldview. You get to understand how they live. Now, if they have the better ideas, if they live in a better place, fine, you could live there too. But if not, at least you understand. You can converse better. You can know how to appeal to them better, not in a manipulative way, but you understand them, right? Okay. I'll come back to that. Let's go to the third. The third step, so we have doubt, principle of charity, and the third one is rigor. And there's not much to say about this except make sure that your ideas, right, just like you do for your opponent now, if you're going to believe something, make sure it's clear. What do you believe? Make sure that it's that you're not jumping to conclusions. Now, this is a hard standard, because if we want absolute certainty for everything before we believe anything, you're not going to believe anything, right? You're not going to have a lot of content. The thing is, though, if you know what's missing, right? As long as you know that you're not jumping to conclusions, That's fine. That makes you a more nuanced human being with more nuanced ideas. So you could say, oh, I believe this, but I lean towards this. And it makes you far less manipulatable. So if you do these three things, doubt leads to openness, right? You break the veil of certainty and the wall of ego. Principle of charity makes you understand people better, better able to evaluate ideas. And the third thing is rigor. You become a more nuanced person. What happens is you become a more empathetic human being. And regardless of whether you change your mind or not, you're better able to relate both to yourself and to other people. So the effect this has is in three ways. It has an effect on you personally, on the social world, right? Your family, your friends, your lovers, whomever, and on the political world. And again, I've been talking for a long time. So if you're really approaching the world from a charitable place, obviously the world becomes more interesting because you're exposed to all these ideas. That in itself satisfies the intellectual part of us. But also makes us better human beings. We're better able to relate. So our relationships become better. Okay. Got it. And politically, obviously, and these days is a good example, you become less polarized society. You can appeal to each other's arguments better. What I had wanted, and I even before I started speaking, I cut it out. What would be a good idea, I thought, was to talk about how actual examples of, we tend to be liberal in this group, to actually examine how those ideas, to see maybe we can have a more nuanced, to challenge them, to see whether we can have a more nuanced idea. And even if we don't change our mind, and I think we would, if we really examined our ideas, we would sometimes, but not, even if not often, at least we would understand the other side and you'd be better able to appeal to it, to reason with it, to understand where they're coming from, what their needs are, and appeal to it. And even if not, you could understand it, you could have an empathy, and you could still have a relationship. The other thing I'd wanted to do is talk about objections, because this is very realistic. I wanted to put more real world meat and bones, but this is things we can do on our own. You know, this is, if you have questions, if we still want to have questions after this, fine. What I want to finish up with is, I just want to say that going back to the Bible, two other verses really meant a lot to me. One is, the first act of responsibility of taking care of other people is when Abraham takes in the three, they turn out to be angels. Up until then, you see Adam and Eve bucking responsibility, Cain and Abel, and that's when you really see a shift. The hospitality, making the world a more hospitable place, taking responsibility for other people. And it's interesting to me that it starts with an individual, a family, and that's right after he made the covenant with God, by the way, an individual, a family, and then it becomes a tribe. The other passage is about Jacob. If you read the passage about Jacob and Esau, Esau's a nice guy. I don't understand why the Jews have a problem with him. He's a nice guy. Jacob's kind of a jerk. You know, he pulls on his heel, he steals the blessing, he runs away. And what does the Esau do when he sees his brother? He runs after him to kill him. He hugs him. So he's a nice guy. So why is Jacob our hero? And I think it's this. Jacob's our hero. Esau is a conventional guy. He kind of lived, think about in these days, he's like a hedge fund guy, has a family, married, but he's conventional. He doesn't really think for himself, doesn't really beyond. Jacob was looking for something greater. And that's why he became Israel. His name changed to Israel after he wrestled with God. That night that Esau was after him, he was scared, and he had the Jacob's ladder dream. He wrestled with angels, and that's where he gets his name. So I want to say that I actually joined this community because I really value I value Judaism, and I didn't find a home in Orthodoxy or stuff. So it lets me satisfy both my sense of peoplehood, right? and intellectual curiosity. But I'm also an Israelite because I think that these questions are important to wrestle with. And I think just in the act of wrestling with them, you become a better person. And it's not just an intrinsic good. Philosophy in itself, it's an intrinsic good. It makes life itself, each moment, not just meaningful, but fulfilling and exciting and all the good emotions that come with life. Anyway, sorry for going on so long, and sorry, this was very hard to put together for me because there's so much I wanted to say, but I really appreciate you listening, and I hope I get to talk to you guys individually soon.